We just saw how a bunch of different apps responded when the connection that they tried to talk to the API over was compromised. They tried to create an HTTPS connection, but Fiddler served up a certificate that they didn't trust, and everything failed. That's good. That is exactly what we would expect. But that doesn't always happen. And I want to give you an example of where it doesn't. I've got an app open on my iPhone at the moment, and it's an app for shopping at a local store down here called Aussie Farmers Direct. Now I want to show you what happens when I attempt to log in to Aussie Farmers Direct. I've just typed in some dummy credentials and I'm going to hit the login button. Now this is interesting, and we can see a couple of things here. So first of all, we can see the tunnel. Now we expect to see that regardless of whether the device trusts the connection or not. But next up, we can see an HTTPS connection. And if we look at this and we go over to Web Forms, we'll see that credentials, username, and password have actually been sent. Just to put some more context around this, let me show you what I'm presently seeing on the iPhone. It looks just like this. It doesn't matter that the login was unsuccessful. What matters is that the credentials were sent to the API. We just saw that in Fiddler. Now this is not a compromised device. How is it managing to communicate via HTTPS when the certificate is not valid? Well, there's actually a very simple answer, and it's that the app doesn't validate the certificate. That might sound very odd, and it is, but inevitably what Aussie Farmers Direct decided at some point, and it was an explicit decision, this does not happen by accident, at least turning it off doesn't happen by accident, but clearly they decided that certificate validation wasn't necessary. Now there is actually a good explanation for why this happens, and it usually comes down to the ease of testing against self-signed certificates. Developers stand up a service somewhere, they don't have a valid certificate, so say for example on their local machine or on an internal test environment. So they create their own self-signed certificate, and to ensure that the app can actually communicate with the service, they disable certificate validation. That's almost understandable, and I'll explain a better alternative to that in just a moment. But clearly what happens after that is that they don't re-enable it before they put the app out into the wild. So even though the API itself may be very secure, if the client no longer validates the certificate, that in itself entirely invalidates the SSL implementation. So the answer to this, to my earlier point, is that if the problem is development, you need to install the certificate on the device itself. And I'll show you how to do this in just a moment with Fiddler. Now there's one more thing I'll leave you with specifically about Aussie Farmers Direct. They've fixed this. There is a new version of the app. It does validate the certificate correctly. And in fact, they changed the app while I was midway through recording this course. So good job to those guys on actually getting it right, but it was unfortunate that whilst that previous version was out there, their SSL implementation was as good as useless. An attacker could have come along, man in the middle of the connection, served up an entirely invalid certificate, and the app would have just happily accepted it and still established the connection and sent sensitive credentials backwards and forwards. But if it makes Aussie Farmers Direct feel any better, it's not just them. In fact, recently, I privately disclosed exactly the same risk to one of our large Aussie banks. This is a financial institution raking in billions of dollars a year, and their app used to do a good job of certificate validation. In fact, I was looking at the app specifically to use it as a good example of validation in one of my presentations. And it was only when I proxied the traffic again that I found that for some reason it had just stopped doing it. Fortunately, that private disclosure was very well received and they fixed it very quickly. But it just goes to show that this sort of thing can even happen with the big guys. So that's enough of working with a device that doesn't trust the Fiddler certificate. Let's now move on and get that device to work hand in hand with Fiddler so that we can start intercepting HTTPS communication between apps and API back ends.